Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully you will be able to see it. Yeah, and let me introduce myself to start with. I think you should be able to see my slides now. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Adriana. Thanks for the intro, Alex. I'm joining today from the UK, and I am a senior consultant at Thoughtworks, which means that I get to work with variety of teams, a good mixture of teams on various different client organizations and in different industries. So over time, I've had different roles. For example, I've been a business analyst, still identify as one, but most recently I've been more involved in delivery management side of things. And my talk today is going to focus on the so-called DualTrack Agile for discovery and development. Although I'm going to cover a few things in my talk around the theory of where this concept comes from, I'm also going to try and focus on the benefits and challenges as I've seen it in a couple of organizations I've seen this applied, and also how you could apply it in practice, and what worked and didn't work for the teams I was in. And then at the end, I'm going to cover a few myths, probably break a few myths around the DualTrack Agile. Before I start though, I want to get the audience a bit, to know the audience a bit better. And so I've prepared a couple of polls that I'm gonna try and launch. Don't worry, this is not a test and it's absolutely anonymous. But I have a couple of questions I want to ask you before I start. So my first poll is really to focus around the familiarity of the audience that we have right here with the DualTrack Agile. So I want to know how familiar you are, and there is a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being not familiar at all, and then 5 being very familiar. I'm going to launch the poll now, and you have around a minute to vote. So if you go to your polling functionality, you can see some people already engaging with it. Amazing. Let's see. I'm going to, after I end the poll, I'm going to share the results with you all, so we can see how it goes. Right, people still voting. Oh, this is really fun to watch. Okay, I think people have kind of stopped voting, so I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. Here we go. Hopefully you can see my results. So a lot of people voted 1, so basically not familiar at all with this model, but there's also a good spread of people that have voted relatively familiar with the model, and even some that are very familiar. Thank you very much. I have a second poll and another question, which is to do with, sort of related, but to do with actually applying the model in real life. So it's one thing to know about it and another thing to actually apply it. So I'm going to launch the second poll. Again, how often have you used this in your teams or your organization? And you could vote from 1, basically never used it, to 5, that you've applied currently or have done so in the past. Let's see what the spread is. People voting. Amazing. We go to some people that have applied it. I'm going to share the results in a little bit. I think people have stopped voting, so I'm going to share the results now. And here are the results. Again, most of the people have never applied it, but there's also some that have, which is great. Thank you very much for engaging with the polls. So it seems that there is a good spread of people. So for those that are not so familiar with the model, I'm really hoping this talk can shed some light and maybe I can share some insights. But for people that are familiar or are currently applying it or have applied it in the past, perhaps you can draw a parallel between your experiences and mine. So hopefully this will be useful for everyone. So if we start from the beginning with some theory, essentially, and where this concept comes from. So it's not a new concept to start with. It dates back from 2005. And a fun fact is that no one actually officially named it DualTrack. But the first reference of something that resembles it was made by Lynn Miller in a paper that they wrote in 2005. And essentially they were talking about a interconnected parallel design and development tracks. A few years later, a colleague of them referenced a similar concept. And then fast forward to 2012, when we have Marty Kagan and Jeff Patton talk about DualTrack Scrum, where there's 2 tracks, one for discovery and one for development, where the outputs of the discovery one feeds into the development one, but those run in parallel as well. And then the discovery one is focusing on determining the what to build, whereas the development track is focusing on determining the how. Later on in the years, Kagan is actually one that speaks a lot about continuous discovery in teams, how to introduce it, has a lot of very interesting blog posts. So if you're interested in the theory behind this model, do check out those names. They're very interesting. So in order to summarize, essentially, the dual track model shows the parallel tracks of discovery and development throughout the product design and delivery process. And essentially, they continually feed back into each other to inform new hypotheses. So it is important to state that we're talking about one process here. So these are not 2 different processes. It is one process for discovery and development owned by one team. And what that could look like visually is something like this. So this is not something I did, by the way. This is from a couple of ex-colleagues who may be on the call and watching. So, but essentially, we have a discovery track and development track, and we have some ideas or observations that we have in discovery. Then we form our discovery hypothesis and some ways to measure those, very important. And then there we run some experiments, preferably low-cost experiments. So this could be anything from different surveys or maybe street testing or just focus groups of users. Workshops or interviews one-to-one, it could be anything, depending on what the hypothesis that you're testing is. And then you measure that and then you learn. And then you either continue learning or that feeds into your build hypothesis and then you actually get to develop it. So you build it and measure it and learn. And then the learnings from that actual software then goes back potentially into your discovery hypothesis to explore more. So this is high level how it works. And there are some benefits that I've seen when this was applied in practice in a couple of organizations. So those organizations were similar in a way, but also different. And they were similar that one was in fintech and one was in healthcare. And one was a startup and one was, I would describe as a scale up. So both of those worked in a very fast-paced environment, very competitive, and they felt the pressure of having to continually learn and innovate so that they stay competitive on the markets that they were on. And their competitors were releasing products and features all the time. They were acquiring new customers, retaining others. So it was really, really a high-pressure environment for them. And essentially, both of those organizations were also going through investment rounds. So it was very important for them to know what sort of things they should invest in so they can get the buy-in from their investors in turn. So in that way, they also worked in very vast product spaces. And that is actually the first benefit I've seen when this was actually applied in practice. So managing the vast product space. So if we take, for example, the fintech organization, there was a variety of products that they could have gone down with and built. Anything from e-wallets to loaning solutions to prepaid card solutions. So essentially, it was really hard for them to narrow down what is the actual product or feature that they wanted to invest in and they want to get the buy-in and build. And so this model provided a systematic way of doing that, of actually checking assumptions, of running experiments, and of proving and disproving hypotheses fast. Essentially, another thing that I've seen that this model helped with on both teams was actually with team comms and stakeholder and user involvement. So as you know, best practice is to have cross-functional teams, but even when you do, there is, I guess there is this notion that people should get involved in different parts, say analysis and user research, but day to day, it's really hard to maintain that. And people tend to fall within their role routines is what I call it. So say developers, they may focus more on the building side, similar with QAs, but then product designers, they may focus more on the discovery side. So actually by applying this model and having these 2 tracks being owned by the whole team, that helped get people involved in parts that they wouldn't naturally be involved in. So I'm talking about, product evolution or conversations or analysis or or user research. And essentially what that ended up to be is it ended up creating this very collaborative environment with our users and stakeholders as well. It created greater knowledge sharing and alignment with team members. Team members knew where things were coming from when they had to build them. That made them happier, essentially, and more motivated to build it. And so basically connecting the customers and the business and the development team helped empathize more with the customer needs and understanding the core problem earlier on. The next thing it helped with was also stakeholder management, and this was something I didn't anticipate, to be honest. And the way it did help is in both the organizations I've seen this applied, there was a lot of stakeholders with a lot of opinions and a lot of ideas of how or of what and how something needs to be built. And so there were so many choices and so many unchecked assumptions. There was no way to have a systematic way to either prove or disprove these. So essentially, introducing the discovery track really helped with that side of things. And stakeholders could actually get involved themselves in experiments that we ran. They could see their ideas, and they could see the investigations and the learnings as an outcome. And they got to make the decision whether those ideas then will get to be built, or they will be parked, or we will have to continue learning about them. And ultimately, this resulted into accelerated delivery of the right thing, because there was less wasted effort into focusing on something that ultimately is not going to provide that much value for the customer. And also that in itself resulted in a lower development costs. So the teams were focusing on building those products and features that were deemed more valuable and beneficial to customers. So this is all the benefits, but as anything else in life, it has its own challenges, and we experienced some of those challenges. So in this section, I'm going to try and present the challenges that I've seen on those teams, and also provide a little insight of how we address those challenges to make them work. So the first challenge really was that notion of split team. So in some organizations, actually, dual agile gets applied in the way that there is one team focusing on discovery and one on development, and that's really not the point. It needs to be one team that owns it. But even when you have one team and it's a cross-functional team and owns both tracks, you still experience the splits, just because in practice, you have people that are naturally more involved in the discovery bit and people that are naturally more involved in the development one. And so a way for us to overcome this was to have the so-called bridge roles. And in one of those teams, I was in that role. So usually that will be, say, someone like a business analyst or a product specialist or manager, whatever you call it in your organization, or maybe it would be a product designer, some sort of that shape of person that will bridge the two tracks and make sure that there is balance between the two, and they do actually go in parallel. So another thing that we experienced as a challenge was actually time boxing discovery activities. And that comes from the fact of when do you decide you've learned enough about something? Is it that you ever learn enough, or is it that you decide to learn something else instead? So answering that question is, I don't have a silver bullet here, but essentially in one of the teams, what we did was we tried to time box our experiments for a week. So we had an experiment of the week, and at the start of the week, we will take a hypothesis, we'll decide how to prove or disprove it, and then by the end of the week, we'll have some sort of output, and then we'll share that. So that allowed us to keep the experiments really, truly low cost and keep activities week by week in the discovery track. That leads me to another challenge, and that's probably the biggest challenge that we experienced, is actually making a call at the end of the day, whether you build something or you kill it or you keep learning about it. I'm going to come back to that call and how we managed it, but essentially not everything from your discovery track will eventually end up in your development, and it shouldn't, essentially. So sometimes you find that there's items that you learned about, you explored, but you'd like to park for the time being because it doesn't align with the organizational priorities, or maybe it's deemed less valuable. And that's really the value of having the two tracks, essentially. And so the fourth challenge was really around prioritization. So that's always hard, but especially when you are prioritizing discovery items, it was really hard to predict what we needed to learn next. And so we addressed it slightly differently in the different teams. And so what we did was, in one of the teams, we had a prioritization matrix that layered all of the activities that we had in discoveries and hypothesis, and whether those linked with the short, medium, or long-term goals for that organization. And so if we deemed that it linked to the short-term goals and it was high value, then that would be prioritized. In the other organization, what we did was, when we were prioritizing discovery items, they would go through a lightweight value canvas of some sort, where you define how to test it, and you defined the relative effort and value, and that's how we managed to prioritize the hypothesis. And then finally, in every project, there comes a time where you have a lot of delivery pressures, which in our case meant that we had to switch sometimes our focus to the development track. So it was really hard to then go back to, again, doing the two tracks in parallel when you've switched the focus. So what helped was, again, that bridging role that kept the team honest. And so say you've decided for a few iterations or a period of time to focus on the development bit, then there has to be a question of, when are we going to also focus on the discovery? So that was the last challenge I have for you. And in terms of how to apply this in practice, I will give you an example of how we actually did it in one of the teams. I'm not saying this would work for you. I'm just saying how we did it. And so again, if we go back to the high level of what this looks like, we have two tracks and they go in parallel and feed back into each other. And so we wanted to visualize the work that goes on in each of those tracks. And we wanted to be able to, essentially track that work and ensure that different members of the team are equally involved. And so this is what it looks like. We had a physical board back in the day. I suppose it will be digital now, but we had a physical board and we had a discovery board and a development board. And what we had was, in the discovery board, we had different categories. So we had ideas that anyone could put on. So any stakeholder that passes by our area could put their ideas on, or maybe team members, or maybe this is something that we found from observing something, or maybe some assumption. And then we had a category where we had our prioritized items for discovery. Again, different ways we handled that prioritization process. Then we had some stuff in progress. So these were really the things that we were actively doing experiments on that particular week, for example. And then there is the decision that I alluded to before. And that's really around, is this something that we learned about and we want to actually develop? Or is it something that we explored and we want to learn more of, in which case it goes back into ideas? Or is it something that we've explored and we kind of want to kill it? So we didn't name it Kill It because it wasn't selling, but we named it Park. So this is something that we parked for the time being. And maybe later on we wanted to evaluate again, but for the time being, it was deemed as something that is not worth investing further effort in, or it wasn't valuable enough for the users. So it was very important to keep track of those items as well. And so essentially that, say the decision is to go into the development board, no matter what sort of method you're using, I suppose, Kanban or Scrum, it doesn't matter. You have some sort of way to track your items in your development. So this is our way of tracking it. And then eventually they get done, which in our case was, they get released to production, and then we get the user feedback, and some of that could feed into the discovery track once again. So there was a few important things that we had to do in order to keep the work going in both tracks at all times. And the first thing is, again, actually, Jeff Patton, I think I read that, he refers to this as a dual track rather than dual track. So essentially, when you have two teams working on the discovery or in the development. So I just wanted to reiterate that this was a shared team's responsibility. It was one team that was working on that, and it was part of one process for that team, essentially, for product development. So we actually had team ceremonies that focused on those two tracks. So say you have stand-up, so you have one for development items, and then we had one for discovery, which made it official that we had updates on both of those tracks. And we also had measures of success for both. We had acceptance criteria to move from items from one category to another. And that was very important because essentially that ensures that we have a good spread of work and ensure that we are focusing on the right things. Another thing that really helped was frequent playbacks to other team members or stakeholders as well. So for example, as you know, not everyone would be able to be involved in both tracks at any given time equally. We tried to pair up in the discovery track items, and we paired up in the development track items, and then we played back what we've learned or what's happened to other team members. And when we had demos or playbacks or showcases to our stakeholders, we always include what is going on in both tracks. So for example, we would include the experiment of the week, what we did, what we found, what's the next thing that we're going to focus on there. And we'll demo some working software at the same time. And that really helped stakeholders to track the ideas from, I guess, experimentation and deciding that you want to build it to actually building it and how it looks in real life. And then last but not least, the definition of done was very important for both tracks, but I have to say that in the discovery one, it's a bit harder to define what done means. Again, it goes back to that question and that decision that needed to be made at some point in time of whether you're done learning about it or is it something that's not valuable to learn about more, or are you going to invest more time to do that? And so the way we made that call was we had to have some sort of level of confidence of the value of the idea based on the learnings and the evidence that we gathered. And so essentially, if we've decided to park it, then we are saying that the relative effort for the value that this particular item or idea delivers is likely lower in comparison to other items. And so essentially the value of it is less than hypothesized. Right, so breaking some myths. So as I was exploring the topic and talking to people, I came across a few myths that I'd like to address. And so the first one is really around that the DualTrack will solve all your problems. And I've seen this tendency in people. They kind of want to find a silver bullet for everything and one size that fits all. And that doesn't really happen ever. And it's not going to happen with the DualTrack Agile. So what I'd say is it really needs to, if you want to apply it, you really need to evaluate your, the context and the situation you're in, the teams, the product function that you have, and your organization, and whether this will fit. And also maybe think about what problems you're trying to address with this. So for example, is it something, do you want to expand to a new market and you don't know much about that? Or do you think that you're lacking that user engagement, that constant, learning loop and continuous discovery? Is it something that you want to encourage in your teams? Do you want to become a bit more product-led, or maybe base your decisions for the portfolio of your products on some of those learnings and some more kind of science, I suppose, or data? Or is it something that's to do with your features and the products that you've launched recently? And maybe you want to change the way you do that in future. So it really depends on what problems you want to address, of whether you apply it. And when you decide to apply it, I'd say there's this assumption that you can just apply it as you go, and you will, and it could get messy. But some of the things to think about is really maybe measuring whether that is something that works for you. Maybe have a trial period and then pivot if needed. Decide how your items are going to move from one category to the other. What is the criteria for that? And maybe decide what the definition of done is, and how are you going to make that call between build it, keep learning, and park an idea. because those are really important things to decide from the start in order to make this successful. And the last myth is really around that notion that all work that is in the discovery track has to move into the development track. So that's not necessarily the case. In fact, in one of the teams, we had quite a log of items that we decided to kill. And that's okay. In fact, it turned out to be more valuable because those are all items that we did not invest any more time and money to building to then realize at the end of the day, it's not something that is of value. So that's, before I wrap up, I do want to run another poll. And I'm going to ask the same question I asked at the start. Let me see. It's basically, how familiar do you feel now with the DualTrack Agile model? So this is really live feedback technique. Amazing. Okay. There's people still voting. Again. Oh, sorry. Actually, I switched the poll. So currently the vote is on how likely are you to use it in your team or organization. I'm gonna end it and share the results. So this is it. So people are a bit more likely to use it. And if I stop sharing. Right, so this is the first question I want to launch, which is how familiar do you feel now with it? All right, here we go. People are voting still, more or less similar spread. I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, and sharing the results. Here we go, very similar to the other poll. Great. Thank you for participating in this poll, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for presenting, Adriana. That was really great. I really love how hands-on you went through that. I really learned a lot in there. Like, I think the questions are coming in slowly. It takes a little bit to be in there. Like, my first curious question would be like, you already had like that it doesn't solve all the problems you're gonna have. But like when you started with it in the first place, like what problems did you want to solve, and did it solve your problems you wanted to solve in the first place?
Yes, the main things we wanted to solve in, say, if I take the example of one of your organizations, is that that organization wanted to make decisions that were more driven by learnings and data, and they've realized that in the past they've made a lot of assumptions, and they didn't check those, and they were launching features and they weren't seeing a lot of usage of those. And they have different goals around customer retention and customer acquisition, and driving more people to use their products. And so they weren't seeing the results that they wanted. So essentially that's one of the problems that they had. And in the other case, it was more around the different product options and the different product decisions. So it was a market that was new for that organization, and they could have gone down various different product options, and they kind of wanted to know which ones are the ones that are really worth it for them, and that really helped them to pitch the ideas they use that to pitch it to their investors. So these are the types of things it helped with for in my examples.
Oh, that's good to hear. Nice. There are now the questions come in. Like, if you have any questions, just put them into the Q&A and we're going to follow up on them. I would like to ask the question from Ralph, and that's just like around the team split. Like, how do you split the time between like discovery and delivery work? Is it like a 50% split, or how do you balance that?
Yeah, it wasn't it wasn't a 50% split. I wouldn't say there's ever a 50% split, but so I'll give you the example with the team that I showed the boards for. And that team was, I think, maybe say 12 people. And that was, included developers, a tech lead, business analyst, a couple of product people, product designer. So it was a very good mixture. There was a QA. It was a very good mixture of a team. And the way we did it was that I think through the ceremonies that we had as a team. So we, for example, had first thing on the beginning of the week, let's catch up on discovery activities, and we had owners and people that were running different experiments, and they will just go off and do that for, say, a day or two, and then they can present their findings. So people kind of switched, like as we ran in different weeks. So for example, one week a developer will be focusing on the development bit, and then the next week they will be pairing with for an experiment for, say, a couple of days. So it wasn't really like a strict rule of how we split it, but I think that's where it was useful to have, even useful to have that visual of like who's working on what exactly, and because then you can see if there's a tendency of like people kind of focusing on like one bit and not the other, or if there is people that are just focusing on one bit and the whole team is focusing on that, and then no one's actually doing anything from the other track. And things like that will come up in like retros, or just kind of touch base with team. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
I think, as I interpreted, it would give me an answer. I hope it also did give an answer to Ralph. Ralph, if it didn't answer your question, please ask again, and we're going to follow up on that one. I think connected to the time, and I think that comes up quite often in the settings we work, is like there's such a high pressure to deliver, and you really have those 2 weeks of sprints, and then how do you manage the resources with this high delivery pressure? And really, like, how do you use the resources to really do this discovery track at all? I think that sounds very familiar for me, but how did you handle it in your setting?
Yeah, so that comes down to one of the challenges I mentioned. Yes, so there was a period of, say, a month, for example, in one of the teams that we really had a very, very aggressive deadline for our development, and it was all hands on deck, and so we made a conscious decision as a team that for that period of time we'll solely focus on or at least the development of effort is going to be focused on the development track. And it's not that we're going to stop our experiments, but we are going to dial down a little bit on that and kind of like switch our focus if possible. And then it was really hard to restart because we were kind of in the groove of things before that. So it was a bit hard to restart it. But again, if you have a couple of roles at least that are kind of like looking at the things that are happening right now in the development, but also forward looking, then you could balance this out, and you could make it work for your team. I think it's more important to understand the why you switched your focus for any given time, and if you accept it as a team, and it was a decision that you made, then great. But ultimately, the discovery track you're probably doing it anyway. Even if you're not doing 2 tracks, you're probably doing, it will fall into your analysis or maybe user research sort of things. And you probably wouldn't do it to that extent. But it's not that much different. It just it is a bit different than what I've seen in other teams that are not applying it.
It sounds that it's just more explicit and you are more intentional how you handle it. Like many things you do anyway, but they are just like not as intentional and visible, and you just make it visible and you manage it in a better way, hopefully.
Exactly. Yes, that's it.
Nice. There are 2 questions which relate to that one, which I would put together. One is from Paul and one from an anonymous person. That's really like, what would be like, does it work in a very small team? Maybe that's the first part of the question. And the second part is really like, what's the optimum team shape of teams working in a dual track development delivery setting? how does having more than one analysis affect success of DualTrack approach, like 2 analysts and 4 devs? Like, yeah, what's the size? Does it work with small teams? And what would you say would be an ideal shape that this can be successful?
So I'm just trying to remember. I think both teams I've seen this applied in were, I mean, it depends on what you mean by a small team. I suppose, is it a pizza size, or are we talking a few pizzas? Yeah, so it was around 10, 12 people both times, I'd say. And the mixture was, you know, mostly developers, but we had, yeah, we had a couple of product people in one of the teams and a business analyst, which was myself. And then we had a product designer, and yeah, and developers and QA. So I guess you usually have that sort of shape of team anyway. So it's not, but I've never used it in teams that are less than 10, I suppose. I think you could use it, but probably it's going to just be not to that scale, essentially. It's going to just be smaller. So maybe you'd not run that many experiments at any given time. Maybe you have only a couple of people working on that any given time, and kind of like going in between the 2 tracks, say if your team is only 5 or 6 people. So I definitely say that you could try it, but I have not tried it myself in smaller than 10.
What would you say about the team composition? Like, what roles would you see in such a team that it can be successful?
Well, that's the thing. I don't think it should depend on the roles, in my view. I mean, ideally, you have anyway, say, your developers involved in this, because it really, really, really motivates people. I mean, the one thing that I've seen in teams that really motivates people is knowing where things come from, understanding what they're building, like who for, and why, essentially, and then seeing it live and seeing it used. That's what I guess that's what motivates me. But I think that's what motivated most of the people in the teams that I was, irrespective of role, like regardless of the role. So it's just say you don't have that many I guess supporting roles, as they call them, like, say, you know, business analysts or product specialists in that particular team, but there will be someone that will wear that hat from time to time. You will have to have people that will switch, and you know, context switching is quite hard, but it is achievable. So even if you're not labeled in the role, you could definitely be the bridge between the two. You could be that person that keeps the team honest and basically pokes them. It was like, have we done this, and are we sure that that gets prioritized for us actually is something that we should be? And that really builds that autonomy and empowerment in teams, so you know, they become more productive and happy.
That sounds great. And I really love how this conversation goes and how this thread is emerging in the conference. Like that, what you said really connects well to what Jan and Rebecca shared before the break, when I really have more mission model. And I think in the missions, there are also more developer working, and they also do some discovery work in there, and it's not just the designers or those roles. And looking forward to the other talks we're going to have, like Sahil and Charlotte talking about designers, developers, and docs, and where they also talk more about the different heads and how they managed it. And I think Amara and Sabrina and James, they also talk about the different hats they are wearing and how they work together on that one, regardless of their role and their setting. So that's really nice. And I think it echoes also what the point you just have been making. Looking at the next question, it's like prioritizing items on the board itself is difficult. How do you manage it in 2 boards in case of limited resources available? Which one gets more priority?
So ultimately, whatever you prioritize in discovery is that investments that you consciously are making to find out whether it's worth building something early on. So I'd say that's pretty important, and I'd say you probably do it anyway, but yeah, prioritization was really hard, and it took us a while to, I don't think we nailed it essentially, but it took us a while. And I think what really helped was in one of the organizations, they had this kind of matrix of different types of, I guess, goals and KPIs that connected to those goals. So they were divided into short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And then when we were mapping our hypotheses or assumptions, we categorized them in one of those, like they are linked to this goal, which is deemed medium, and thus maybe this is lower priority. But then we also layers the value of it, and so that really helped us to prioritize it. And then you could, and that also drove the prioritization of, drove the prioritization of both tracks essentially. So I think it's harder to start, but once you do start, it kind of becomes easier, because usually the discovery bit will probably go a bit in advance, so to say, like it has to go first essentially, and then you have something to build, and then just the wheel keeps spinning. So I think you just need to start it and yeah, figure it out. But another thing that really helped us, and it kind of connects to one of the questions I can see here around, you know, the right scale of the topics. So what we did was, again, in one of the organizations, we had like a value canvas. So we had a main hypothesis, and maybe there were some hypotheses that broke out of it. So we tried to go with the smallest bits, and then we had some sort of way of like, what is actually the riskiest assumption that we're making here? Let's test that first. So we had a category with like the main hypothesis, and then the different hypotheses that come out of it, or the different assumptions that we have, and then what is the riskiest one, and then, you know, the users and the measures and which goal that could relate in. And that really helped us to first break down the chunks, and second, to prioritize them in terms of, I guess, risk. And I'm not talking about risk right now, but let's say risk in the kind of medium future. So that was another way we addressed it. It's not easy though.
Cool. Thank you very much. Maybe one more question goes in there. Maybe a very simple one. There are actually two great ones. One is around how you measure it, and how you, that's a constantly one coming up. So really like how, what measures that crop up more frequently or pop up. I think it's one, regardless of engagement and team. Like how do you make it more tangible, and how do you see like when are you on the right track, and when are you successful with the product but also with the team?
Yes, so the way we did it is we tried to shape most of the items that we had in discovery in the hypothesis type way. So, you know, you have, it's you probably know that, but basically you believe something, and then there is some sort of measure attached to it. And so say, you know, you think, say a goal is, you know, driving more usage of your product, or maybe customer acquisition, and then maybe a hypothesis you have as a result is, you know, having an in-app onboarding experience or something for users, and which you think it's going to drive, you know, the usage of it and people signing up with X percentage. So it has to be very specific kind of figure, maybe, and then, you know, and then you maybe have some sort of prototype, or some sort of experiment that you run as a result, and then you can see the results against that measure. So that's a very specific example. I can't actually give two specific examples without revealing the clients, but yeah, so you just have to make sure that your measurements are something tangible. And you know, most of the times, if you could connect it with a quantitative measures, but sometimes it will be qualitative, essentially. So for example, in the fintech client, we were exploring that loan solution, and what was people's perception of loaning and borrowing money. So that was more qualitative data that we got out of it. But yeah, it could go both ways.
Thank you very much, Adriana, for sharing your insights there.